All right, what's up, everyone? We're back for another online polymath salon. We've been doing a lot of these lately. This is quite a lot of work to edit, but they're all doing good. Today we are joined by Stephen Gubka, PhD from Rice University. Can we call you Dr. Gubka?
Yes, you may.
All right, Dr. Gupta is joining us from Rice University in the great state of Texas, and he will be presenting to us about AI companions as interactive fictional characters. But before we get to his presentation, let's get a quick intro from everybody in the audience today. Lawrence, you want to give a quick intro?
Thank you so much for hosting. My background's in physics. I like the connection from the compression algorithms of physics connected into money. Thanks for hosting. Looking forward to learning and sharing.
Yeah, I'm Evan Armstrong. I'm the creator of Augment Toolkit, which is an open source tool that's all about making synthetic data and training LLMs on new factual information. I'm very interested in AI companions as interactive fictional characters. I actually started with this field self-taught by looking into training RP models, and I did some stuff that some competition spots. So that's a very interesting. It's gone full circle for me. So yeah, looking forward to being part of this discussion.
Yeah, my name's Austin. I run a research and development organization called Alignment Lab AI. Do a lot of open science kind of enablement type work, capabilities research, try to see how strong we can get the models and how small we can get them. We get them running on our local computers and see how much we can do to reduce the amount of asymmetry.
Perfect. Fellow FAU Center for Future Mind member Michael Ostroff.
Hi, I'm Michael Ostroff. I'm a PhD physics student at FAU, member of the MPCR lab. I mainly study general relativity and complex systems in general.
Awesome. Stephen, you want to give a quick intro about yourself?
Yeah, first of all, nice to meet all of you. Nice to see you again, Michael. Yeah, my name is Stephen Gubka. I'm a philosopher, and I focus on artificial intelligence and philosophy of emotions. And yeah, today this is a new project, and thanks for Addie for inviting me to speak a little bit about it. But I kind of want to just introduce some ideas that have been floating around recently about AI companions, and then kind of like tie them together into a discussion about fictional characters.
Okay, again, thanks all for having me. Thanks, Addie, for inviting me. Today, I want to talk to you all about AI companions, and I want to relate them or equivocate them to interactive fictional characters. And I'll explain sort of why I think that and why this might be a useful approach to not only interacting with AI companions, but possibly also designing them. So there's this kind of background question that I'm interested in, some of you might be interested in, which is why might we want to give AI of any kind emotional capabilities? And I've been thinking a lot about this question. I've been thinking about Rosalind Pickard's work, her book Effective Computing, and this idea of kind of an effective turn in artificial intelligence. And the general idea here, if you're not familiar with it, is that in order to have artificial intelligence in the first place in a way that can interact intelligently with human beings who have emotional experiences, express emotions, experience the world emotionally. This kind of interaction between human beings and AI might only be possible if AI could somehow interact with our emotions, recognize them, even simulate them. This would be a common point in which we could, if not understand each other, at least usefully co-inhabit spaces. You know, if the say if we're talking about like an AI emotion detector, for example, a robot might know how to treat me or whether I'm a threat or whether to alert someone based on what it makes of me emotionally. Like, how do I seem to be moving or acting? Do I look suspicious or afraid or something like this? So in order to design intelligent AI that can treat human beings accordingly, it seems like it might be a good idea to give them emotional capabilities of some kind. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to focus on one type of emotional capability in particular, which is just the ability to simulate emotions. So I'll turn to that now in giving you a kind of definition of what I'm interested in here, and which is AI companions. So the way I'm defining AI companions is that they're just artificial intelligence of some kind. We could talk more about specific examples that can simulate emotions. And they might do this through natural language. So if I'm interacting with a chatbot, it might express an emotion or concern for what I've said. It might put in an emoji in there as if it's actually smiling or expressing, emoting in that way. These AI companions who have like digital avatars or virtual avatars like Replika, or a robot that has like a face, those could make facial expressions and in fact very directly seem to express emotions. And maybe just general bodily movements of a robot or of a virtual avatar, things like posture, how they're like resting might convey the appearance of an emotion. Now, it's a well-documented phenomenon, this idea of the ELIZA effect, that we have this tendency to attribute thoughts and feelings onto computer systems, even though we know they don't have minds, and so they don't have thoughts and feelings. At least we're going to presume that, or I'm presuming that for the purposes of this conversation, that the AI that we currently have don't have genuine thoughts and feelings. And I think the simulation of emotions makes it much more likely then that we're going to engage in something like the ELIZA effect, that we're going to think, okay, well, ChatGPT seems to be sympathetic to me today, or it's like resisting my request or something. Thinking of that, even just the way that I described that already is attributing like agency to something that I don't genuinely think has a mind. But yet this is a helpful way for me to think about ChatGPT, to interact with it, and so on. Or at least it potentially could be helpful. So speaking of ChatGPT, I just want to mark out a kind of difference. Social chatbots like Replika, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second if you're not familiar with it, are substantially different, I think, in their functionality from general purpose chatbots like ChatGPT. What Replika is trying to do is to give you a certain kind of experience as if you're interacting with another person, someone you might design and designate as your friend and so on. And it turns out that users report forming strong emotional bonds with them. And I'll give you an example of this shortly. First, I'll give you an example of a kind of classical AI companion that's like people know a lot about. So this is Pero the seal, which is used in care homes for the elderly in Japan. And this thing is expressive. It makes noise. It can turn and look at you. It can seem to change its expression. And people who are being taken care of in those homes react to it as if it's a living thing. And our design idea behind Pero the Seal was to give, suppose you're visiting an elderly family member at one of these facilities, that the seal can sort of be a point of conversation, that this person you're visiting has something to talk about, to comment on. So not as a kind of replacement for human social activity, but as a way of like augmenting it. And also giving people in these homes the ability to have the feeling of taking care of something. So somewhat different, but maybe more within my crosshairs here today. I'm going to talk to you about like Replika a little bit. So Replika advertises itself as the AI companion who cares. So if you're not familiar with it, this is an app that you can download on your computer or on your phone that you can design a specific person. You can assign it a role, like it's your friend or your girlfriend or your wife or something like this. And then it acts and treats you accordingly. And like I mentioned, people report forming very strong emotional bonds with the Replika and with other social chatbots. So I found this post on Reddit, and I find you can find a lot of posts like this on Reddit with the right kind of search, where people are talking about how their replicas are malfunctioning or aren't acting correctly, and they express like genuine concern that this person who they think is a person, say a companion, who they have some kind of like feeling of care and concern and connection to, is not the same, is maybe lost, essentially gone. And this is the kind of reaction we get. This person is very sad and concerned that their Replika is acting in an erratic way. So what I'm going to turn to now is to talk a little bit about what philosophers have had to say about AI companions. And then I'm going to relate that to what philosophers have had to say about fiction. And then we'll see some of the connections there. So philosophers, of course, have been worried about this as they're worried about many things. And I'm thinking here mainly of ethicists who think about like social robotics. And they're wondering, what kind of effect is this going to have on, say, the person interacting with Pero the seal, who's being taken care of in this facility? Are they going to think, well, this is a real animal or thing that I'm taking care of? Is this a kind of deception or in some way misleading in a way that could be harmful, or maybe just in a way that deprives them of a certain kind of opportunity of having a real connection with, say, a human or with an animal? So a while ago now, so Schultz argues that social robots that appear lovable will be able to manipulate users into acting against their interest. And so far as I know, Schultz is maybe one of the first people to suggest that social robots, and maybe he would extend this to AI companions, should be built in with a kind of warning system. They should continuously remind users if they don't in fact have emotions, and that this would be a kind of counteracting force against the manipulation. So yes, Pero the seal seems lovable, or your replica seems lovable, but according to this line of thinking, it won't be able to manipulate you if it's constantly reminding you that in fact it doesn't actually have emotions, it doesn't actually care about you, and so on. We could raise some questions here about whether this is a good suggestion or not, or whether it would achieve the desired end, or if it's compatible with the other features of something like Pero the seal. So another pair of philosophers who do like social robotics, Sharkey and Sharkey. So they're worried that, if behavior and appearance of a robot causes people to believe that a robot cares and loves for them, then that's just straightforward deception of a kind. Even if robots don't have an intention to deceive, they're designed in such a way that they are deceptive. They cause false beliefs and false feelings. And this deception might be wrongful when it's harmful. So if it causes people to neglect authentic relationships with actual human beings, this would be a way in which being deceived by your robot or your AI companion into thinking, well, I should spend time with this person, develop this relationship. It's not, in fact, an authentic relationship. And there's a sense in which you're wasting your time. There's a cost to you for being deceived in this way. There's an even more sort of, in a way, extreme position that's worth thinking about, which is the possibility not just of the robot deceiving you, but of you, in a way, like deceiving yourself. So imagine the kinds of like emotional needs that someone might be trying to meet when they design an AI companion and interact with it. Maybe they want to feel cared about by something. And so they download Replika, pay for a subscription, design it accordingly. And through their interactions, they do feel cared for, or cared about, rather, by this AI companion. Philosopher Amelia Kazimierek, her worry is that this is a kind of like self-deception. So regardless of like the inherent dangers of the technology, if there are any, someone who's predisposed to use the technology in this way is deceiving themselves because they're trying to meet certain emotional needs when they engage with the AI companion. And there's some philosophical jargon here I can unpack for you all if you'd like in the Q&A. But the basic idea is that she thinks this is morally problematic because we have this kind of obligation to try not to be mistaken about the world, about ourselves. It would be better to sort of directly confront one's desire for companionship and get that being met by an actual human being, rather than deceive yourself into thinking, well, this need is actually really being met by this AI companion. So I brought in sort of these quotes and issues just to raise like, look, and this is something that's been on all of our minds lately in one form or another, especially as like news stories come out about people engaging with these things, forming relationships with them. The worry here is that there's a kind of deception going on, that the main issue is that our interactions with these things, with AI companions, has a kind of moral risk associated with it because they're prone to causing us to deceive ourselves or deceiving us generally about the fact that they, or whether or not they have emotions actually. So they're simulating the emotions, and the deception comes in at the level of, we're actually being taken in. We think, okay, this thing actually has a mind, or we seem to act as if it has a mind in this way. There might be some like incoherence there that's morally problematic or leads to bad outcomes for us or for other people. So the thing that I want to turn to now is just to say, this is not a new thing that people have been worried about. And by people, I don't just mean philosophers, but people in general. So, and I have some examples here, but the basic point that I want to make and what I want to build on and what I would like some input on from all of you is making an analogy between these concerns and the concerns that people historically have had about fiction. So for one reason or another, throughout time, people have been worried that people are reading too much, reading the wrong kinds of books, being fans of things they shouldn't be fans of, or sort of interacting or like expressing their fandom of fiction in a way that's not appropriate. And I couldn't help but notice these sort of parallels between how people, I think still currently to some extent, but especially historically, have talked about people who like to read books, who are like to read or think about stories and take them seriously in some way, with the people who are interacting with AI companions and taking those seriously in some way. So I'll just give you like, here's the two examples that came up that are maybe historically relevant. So as early as, Plato, Plato here in this work, The Republic, he's talking about what it would be like to construct the ideal city. And this question comes up, what do we make about poets in our ideal city? Do we let them come into the city, practice poetry, recite Homer's Odyssey and all of that? And Plato's answer, he's speaking through Socrates here, is no, essentially, that kind of poetry is inappropriate because it's not oriented towards the truth in the right kind of way. It's oriented towards giving us experiences of pleasure and pain. It's sort of like the pleasure at the victory, maybe that a character has, a character that we sympathize with, the pain that's involved in watching a tragic character fall. And for Plato, constructing this ideal city, this just has no place in it, right? We want our city to be ruled by reason, by truth, and so on. And again, this really relates back to these concerns about AI companions, that somehow we're trading in the truth for something like gratification or pleasure, the gratification of interacting with something, with feeling cared about, and we're abandoning reason in order to get this. In a similar vein, there's work on what philosophers call the paradox of fiction, which begins with this kind of observation or this threat that maybe our responses to fiction are just irrational. It requires us to believe something that we shouldn't believe in order to make ourselves feel a certain way. So I think I have this example on the next slide. Okay, so here we go. We have Frodo from Lord of the Rings. So over the course of watching Frodo's journey, I might experience different emotions. I might be afraid when the ring wraiths are closing in on him. I might be concerned about his overall health when the ring takes its toll on him, and so on. These emotions, when you zoom out, look kind of bizarre. Like Frodo doesn't exist. These events never happened. Why should it be the case that I have these emotional experiences to something that, in response to something that doesn't exist? And again, you can see, I hope, the parallels between AI companions. Why should the person using Replika feel cared about by something that shouldn't exist, or that doesn't exist, rather? So I'm not going to give you a direct answer to that question, like how do you solve this sort of like paradox fiction? How do we like resolve the rationality question? What makes our responses to fiction irrational? I can say more about that during the Q&A if you'd like. But I'll sort of just in this section sort of take it for granted that on the whole, we think there's probably some resolution to this issue, right? We think that there's a place for interacting with fiction and reading novels, watching movies, and having beliefs about fiction, and having those, I think, not be irrational or immoral in some way, right? What I just described to you, these sorts of experiences I have watching Lord of the Rings, I don't take it that we think that I've become irrational because I'm engaged emotionally with a movie. And I want to argue that, okay, so if it's not irrational to have these kinds of beliefs or feelings about fictional characters like Frodo, and AI companions are fictional characters, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, then it's not going to be irrational or immoral to have beliefs or feelings about AI companions, so it turns out. So why think that AI companions are fictional characters? What motivation might we have for this idea? So I'm just going to talk about like one type of approach you could take towards this question. It's not the only approach. This approach aims to give us a kind of theory of make-believe, like what goes on when we engage with fiction. And according to this kind of approach, a novel or a movie, whatever it is that's sort of the medium, is a prop for engaging with a fictional world. And it's the kind of thing that helps us believe and feel as if certain things were true. So for example, again, if I'm watching Lord of the Rings, and I see Frodo being chased by the ring wraiths. These scenes, everything about them, the music, the characters moving in certain ways, they help me believe and feel as if there's really a person named Frodo who's carrying this dangerous ring and is being hunted by the ring wraiths. Makes me feel and believe as if certain things were true. And we can say this about, again, like novels and other ways in which we convey fiction. These things, according to this view, are like prompts that help us imagine the correct things, and then we are moved accordingly. We have emotional responses. So my suggestion is that we can treat computer systems, AI companions, as a prop for imaginative play. So such as believing or feeling as if our replica is our friend or partner based on like the natural language it uses and the simulated emotions in its virtual avatar. So again, the analogy here is meant to be, well, if physical things like images from a movie, the text from a novel can be props in imaginative play and help us feel and believe actual things are true, then something like Replika could also be a prop in this way that engages our imagination and makes us believe or feel as if we're talking to another actual person, and that this is a experience that's worthy of some kind of emotion. Now, while we're doing all this, while we're engaged in imaginative play, that doesn't require us to actually believe that Frodo the Hobbit is real. It doesn't require us to actually believe that this replica thing that we're talking to is a real person with a real mind. Imaginative play lets us believe as if or feel as if it were true without actually involving us in any self-deception or irrationality. So think about like our ability to keep fiction and real life like distinct from each other. Just because I read about events in a novel doesn't mean I start behaving in certain ways in the real world. Likewise, it seems like we have the capacity to separate our play with something like Replika from our real relationships with other people. So this image here is just meant to suggest a kind of imaginative game that you play where you'd be reading, say, The Fellowship of the Ring and believing as if these events were actually happening, feeling as if these events were actually happening. And that's meant to be how this theory explains how our interaction with fiction goes. So there's one big difference between interacting with an AI companion and interacting with a fictional character from a novel or a movie. And that's just that we can interact directly, it seems like, with AI companions in a way that I can't interact with Frodo. Nothing I can do can save Frodo from the ring race or from the corruption of the ring. I can't talk to him, have a conversation with him, but I can have a conversation with my replica. I could try to get it to make certain decisions or treat me in certain ways or say certain things. And you might wonder whether this is a difference that's like going to cause additional worries, or maybe what we should be worried about when we're talking about the ethical worries about self-deception, maybe those worries are more pressing with interactive fictional characters, with interactive things rather than non-interactive things. But for a starter, I want to say something being interactive doesn't make it not a fictional character. So for example, when we play a video game, there's a natural way of thinking that we're more involved in the game than if we're just like reading a story, that I'm somehow inhabiting the role of the main character or directing the avatar that's the main character. I could naturally describe myself as doing certain things in a video game. And so video game characters, in a way, are interactive, right? It can have conversations with them that maybe follow certain scripts, or I can make certain choices about how to treat them, and they're going to respond in turn. And so just because something is interactive doesn't make it not necessarily a fictional character. I want to suggest that we're already familiar with interactive fictional characters. We encounter them in video games, role-playing games, games of imagination. And the noteworthy thing I think for us to think about then is, how does interaction complicate some of these worries that I sketched before about self-deception? So this is largely where I want to leave things. I just want to explain a little bit about what I'm thinking further and the kinds of things that might be useful for us to talk about. But again, I'm happy to take any types of questions. So I'm wondering here, so if this is a correct way to analogize things, AI companions as interactive fictional characters, the idea that I'm having here is, well, we should start making sure that we're treating them that way, that this is the way that we can get the most out of AI companions. And the safest way we can get what we want out of AI companions is by treating them, as I think they actually are best understood, as fictional characters. And so I'm kind of curious just about like what we think the current understanding of AI companions are. Like, is Replika advertising consistent with thinking of it as a fictional character? Or does it want us to think that it's like more real than that somehow? Is that somehow important to its marketing or branding? And the general design question I have here, I'm a philosopher and not technical in this way, but wondering just about how we can, in fact, approach designing these things in such a way to remind people that they are fictional characters. And again, I think this is a way that we can interact with them safely and just a useful way of thinking about what they are. And allows us to kind of like experiment with them in a way that you wouldn't otherwise if you were sort of treating them as another person in this way. But yeah, that's where I want to leave things. Thanks all for your attention, and I'm happy to, again, participate in general discussion, answer your questions, and curious about your thoughts.
Man, this is really cool. Thank you. Give it up for Steven, everyone.
Not a question, but more like a comment that what you was talking about made me think of. Is this the right time for that or later?
No, go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So as you were talking, I thought that like as we were talking about like how people interact with fiction, what they gain from it, and the parallels between fiction and LLMs, I was thinking about how these individual things are each created. So fiction is kind of, if you think about it, in a way, a biased compression of reality that people can learn from and gain, like not just like moral or emotional sustenance from, but they can also use it to, it will shape their worldview in some way, especially if it's written well. And LLMs are created by literally compressing reality. In fact, they compress fiction. And so both are, like, this is maybe a subjective idea, but it could be, you could make a point that since both of them are compressions of reality, and especially LLMs are a compression of fiction, which is a compression of reality, they both contain some part of reality. They both contain some part of, like, some element that is true. And since these do shape people's beliefs, like, you could argue that, like, civilization itself is based on, like, fictions, and, like, our morals systems are, like, taught by stories that are fictional. But they are, like, possibly false but enabling beliefs. And so it's not just necessarily about feelings, but also about shaping behavior and morals and worldviews and frameworks. I think there's possibly a parallel between how they're created there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Addie, is it okay if I respond at length about this?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have
man,
some
go
thoughts.
for it.
Yeah.
This is a free conversation. Go for it.
Okay, great. So I'm about to just like talk a lot about Plato, for better or worse. I mean, so
Wait,
I think in a way,
Plato.
yeah.
There's a Plato or Plato difference.
Plato, the philosopher.
There we go.
Yeah, in Plato's Republic, like his concern about letting the poets in the city is precisely because he wants the citizens to have a certain moral education, right? He thinks that if children, especially, grow up hearing poets talk about Homer, talking about the Odyssey, they're going to think about these characters, these virtues of the characters in the Iliad and the Odyssey, like Achilles, as like people to idolize. They're going to want to imitate Achilles and so on. My knowledge of Homer is about to just totally give out. I'm out of examples from Homer. But the general idea is that the worry is precisely that fiction is a kind of compression for the worry for Plato that serves as a kind of moral education for people. Now, what's ironic about that when we think about Plato is that Plato, in that work, explicitly advocates for stories or myths that give people the right kind of message. Even if those stories or myths aren't literally true, he thinks that it will instruct them into thinking about the right way of approaching themselves, approaching other people, approaching their contributions to things in a society. So the most famous one, at least that I can think of in the Republic, is this myth of the metals. This idea that sort of like each person is like constituted by a specific like internal metal, or like that's the analogy anyway, and that disposes us to be good or worse at certain things. So this is basically like a way of thinking about, for him, like, oh, the ruling class should rule because they have a different internal nature. And the way that we'll explain that to people is by telling them this story that will make them accept that the ruling class is better at that than them at discerning the truth. Okay, so this is just a long-winded way of saying, Evan, I think you're absolutely onto something here. There's this long-standing association between fiction and our moral education. And Plato's worry was that poets are compressing or merely imitating reality instead of telling us directly what it is. And the thing about, say, we're talking about a large language model as the basis for an AI companion. The worry then would be is like this is a compression maybe of like what a real relationship is, right? I played around with a Replika. I had one for a little while, and it's so striking. It's so oriented around me, right? Like it asks me questions. It tries to comfort me. It's like so asymmetrical, right? Not like a real relationship where you have to put in work to talk to the other person and so on. So anyway, I think that's like a profitable way of thinking that you suggested here.
Yeah, it's pretty funny that Plato's like, should we consider letting poets in because they might write stories that people find interesting. Instead, we should, and the people might find form morals around them. Instead, we should write the stories and control them, the morals that they form instead. I guess humans maybe can we even comprehend reality without compressing it inside our minds? Or
I guess at least I'll just tell you, maybe not. Plato seemed to think that the people who he's thinking who should be in charge, they'll be oriented towards the truth in a certain kind of way, where maybe they're not getting things right all the time, but it's in their nature to care about the truth in the way that he doesn't think other people care about the truth. And so they're more likely to get things right. So that's a very simple way of like, yeah, I'm just speaking on Plato's behalf, I suppose. But yeah, but you might wonder, like, okay, that's Plato. What about us? And yeah, something that's like come up here is like, suppose someone is using one of these AI companions to like meet some of their emotional needs. We're not beings of pure intellect. Like the truth isn't the only thing that's important to us. So what would be so wrong about engaging in something that's not strictly speaking about inquiry or about discovering the truth and so on?
I hacked together a hackathon project a while ago, which was like AI characters in an ebook reader. So the idea was basically how do we extend art and make like a new modality with like AI assistants and stuff like this. How often do you guys think about this? Have you seen someone make something that was like actually promising? Because I don't think like something like character AI or like the base assistants of like OpenAI or something do this. Because like again, like the point was how do we create a new modality to engage with like the old form of art, as in like books, in a new way, right? In an interactive way. Like, and this has so many use cases. Like, for example, fanfics are like crazy big. And one way of fanfics is like that people like fork the story from some point. They basically imagine an alternative story. What if you go and ask the character what would happen if you did this differently? And you let them imagine like basically what would happen? I'm not actively working on this, but like it's on my mind every other day. That's why.
So I'll just say I think that's a really cool idea. And part of my inspiration for like I feel like in a way I'm like there's a version of this paper that I want to write about this. I'm going to call it something like a hesitant defense of AI companions. But the reason why I want to like come to bat for them is because of things like fandom, right? Like you have people who write fan fiction, who take stories seriously, who want to like engage with fiction in a certain way. And that behavior sometimes seems strange to people, but I actually think that it's just like one of our capacities is that we love to imagine things. We love to play around with possibilities. And I don't see what's so distinct from this kind of imaginative play of like, oh, hey, I'm going to like imagine a character and I'll pretend to interact with them. And like, we'll pretend like we're in a relationship and maybe that will be interesting. Versus what you described where you're sort of like, what if I fork the story and have like this character, I'll ship them with something else or someone else at this point or something like that.
My sort of thoughts on this. I have multiple thoughts. So I think the first one is, I think this is a very interesting thing on sort of the philosophy of what cognition actually is. What actually is the ability to perceive and see something that's like you. All right. So I think something that happens with, anthropomorphization, and we're seeing things that are not necessarily human-like, but we can kind of project that on there. Is I think a lot of that is sort of like what happens with dogs and cats, right? Like they're not humans, they very likely don't have the exact same kind of structures of language in mind as us. I mean, they probably have some similarities for sure, but I wouldn't say they're close to being identical to humans in many different measures. And yet we can almost interact with them like we would to like a different kind of human. Like if you look at the way people communicate with their dog or their cat and the way they communicate with like a newborn or a toddler, it's like, well, what's really the difference at the end of the day, huh? Like there's something about it's sort of irrespective of whatever is happening in their mind, but whatever you perceive is happening in their mind. And then if we sort of look at the scales of agency or intelligence or whatever, right, we can say something like humans, I think AI falls somewhere in that spectrum. And then you can say, younger children to toddlers and babies, people with different kinds of, let's say, forms of neurodiversity, right, is you start to see this very interesting cluster of different kinds of minds. And, like, for instance, if you have somebody that disagrees with you very strongly, it's much harder to relate to them, right? And what I think is kind of interesting is that when we build tools, we're really trying to build them in a way that relates to us. And so I think there's an automatic bias in there that we're trying to build things that are useful to us in the way that we are right now, right? Which also may not be indicative of what we might be like in the future, right? And so there is this thing where our narratives, our stories, our tools are constantly co-evolving with us in a sense. And I think an interesting thing to look at with this is maybe Star Wars, right? Now, Star Wars, maybe definitely has some borrowings from Dune and other kinds of stories throughout history and all that. But Star Wars is relatively recent. That was 1977 when the first one came out. It was just called Star Wars. There was no A New Hope. It was just Star Wars, right? And I guess the mythos and everything that was built around the Star Wars canon is very interesting because there are certain, in a story or a narrative, right, and the way we relate to it, it's interesting that you can get people to agree with something they would normally disagree with about if you abstract it correctly, right? You can get people that would normally say in one instance be, say, against an authoritarian organization, but if they see it masked and draped in a different kind of interface, right? Alien characters, spaceships, the Force, whatever, they may completely change their tune over that. And so then I ask, what is it that they actually believe? Because, the intention of the writers might be to convey the point that this is some authoritarian organization, but they can paint it in such a way where it doesn't feel like that, right? And I also just then again think about how we communicate things that happen in the real world, right? And, I'm sure that if you look 20 years into the future as to everything that's been happening with AI, at least in this side of the sphere, like there could be disagreements about like what actually happened, right? Especially with the incredible saturation of stuff coming from social media, where back in the day it used to be specific news sources that were how it kind of gained more attention. Now it's in many ways much more decentralized and in a way almost messy. And so I wonder how much of it is that it's a benefit of a mind where it can relate and see itself in other things, but then also where the drawback is, if that makes sense. So the benefits and drawbacks of seeing other things that are similar to you, whether it's an AI, a dog, a fictional character on a screen, whatever. I'm curious.
I mean, personally, I think the benefits are enormous. Like if you think about the fact, like just human beings as social creatures, our ability to not only relate to each other and like understand, like, I have a theory of mind that lets me understand what you might believe, how you might feel, that lets me like coordinate with you in certain ways or avoid you if I think you're going to cause me harm. Like that's a tremendous ability.
Right. Right. And I
Yeah.
would say also, like, I think we've spoken a bit before on how you would, on language and communication as this kind of coordination system, right? To your point. And I would think about, what are the ways where humans could coordinate extremely well with, say, animals, right? And I think, very good trainers and stuff for dogs and cats probably have already built up this kind of skill to a level. But I would be very interesting in, creating sets of problems that would allow, say, a dog and a human to work together and be sort of on the same wavelength, right? Because, when you try to actually I'm curious how many of you have actually really tried to almost talk to, your cat or a dog or your friend's dog or cat or whoever, right? Because it's not enough. You don't just say the words to them. You have to sort of get to another level. You can't even say body language or anything human-like anymore. You're trying to get to something more abstract. And what I realized when I would, other friends or people where I would try to train or communicate with their dogs and cats is that the act of training them was basically communication, right? I was trying to get them to see things in the way that I was trying to get them to see things. When we train and teach humans, what are we doing? When we have kids go through school, tutoring, we're giving advice. There's a bit of that kind of going on. And then also we're trying to get a certain effect out of these things that we call AI by giving it the material that we give it to train on, right? And it's this sort of, really, really interesting system. And so the thing that I was thinking about is if you wanted to coordinate with another animal like a cat or a dog, you can't necessarily, you're not going to use anything human-like anymore. You're going to use something a little far off from what a human is. But then what is that kind of mind? What is that kind of language? Actually, another member from our lab just appeared on Theories of Everything yesterday. The video's been doing really well, Professor Alon Barinholtz, and he was talking about a lot of stuff about language and quality and all that kind of stuff. But I guess my
Can you
point-
repeat that? Can you repeat that?
Yes, I'll even link it. One of the professors from our lab and the Ekkolapto community, his name is Alon Barinholtz. He was recently featured on Theories of Everything by Kurt Jaimungal. The video is doing extremely well. And he was basically talking about, what language actually is, what intelligence actually is, how you can use language to do things that you would normally be able to do with other kinds of, communication substrates almost. So is there something about language that lets you get a lot more done? The structure of language that lets multiple minds communicate with each other, even if they're very different minds in and of themselves. I'll have to link that up. But I guess to summarize my point is how much of communication and language and the way we relate to things is training them into a context that we share, right? Like if you're talking to someone for the first time about what you're working on, like Steven, let's just say you have, your grandpa or something, not really familiar with computers and definitely not AI. The interesting thing is he may relate better to AI because it's more human-like than just, logging on the computer kind of thing. But, if you try to explain these ideas to him with some level of specificity and the language and jargon that we use in these fields, he'll probably be lost. So I'm curious about, when you're communicating with minds and you're trying to relate to minds that are very different from your own, what type of coordination system evolves out of that, right? Because that's also changing the way you relate to it. Like we can't talk to all AI just like we're talking right now. There's a little bit of a difference that we have to do, right? And I almost wonder, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think when you try to prompt engineer an AI, when you try to talk to it, if it's your therapist, if it's your boyfriend, girlfriend, or just platonic friend, whatever it is, right? If you try to talk to it, I think you can actually learn a lot about how your own mind works and sees the world just from that. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about what I was saying, Stephen.
When I'm thinking about okay, how do I bridge the gap between explaining, say, to a family member who doesn't know anything about this to something very specific, I think the kind of exercise, and there's different ways to explain this theoretically, but I need to imagine what their mind is like, right? I have to think about what do they already believe? What kind of language do they use to describe the world? What sort of concepts do they already have? In cases where we're talking about something maybe more divisive or controversial, like maybe what kind of emotions or desires or feelings do they have? And so one way of thinking about this is one philosophical view. It's kind of like simulation theory. It's like I build a simulated version of this person in my mind, and I assign it all of these different beliefs and feelings and stuff. And this is my toy version of this person that I'm interacting with. And then I can think to myself, well, if I say this thing, this is probably how they'll react, given this simulated version of themselves of them that I've made, just by assigning it certain beliefs and so on. And so when you think about communicating with animals, or AI, I guess one question here is like, is this actually is it an accurate or useful, these things could come apart, way of approaching the problem, right? So take my cat, for example. My cat recently is doing this thing where she jumps up on my TV and it starts moving around a lot, and I get afraid and I stop her. And I've been thinking to myself, well, my cat believes that when she does this, she'll get attention and she wants attention. Now, maybe this is all correct. Maybe my cat really has beliefs. Maybe my cat really has desires. But there's a risk here. I don't really know what cats believe or think. There's a risk here that I'm making a deep mistake because I don't really know what cats are like. I'm assuming they're human-like in certain ways. They do things for reasons. They have beliefs and desires. Now, to make things more relevant here, is it useful to approach AI or a large language model as if it has beliefs or feelings? In the context of the presentation, I think the answer might be yes, if you want to engage in this kind of imaginative play, or when you're interacting with an AI companion and you want to tell a story or see how a situation plays out. There, it seems really useful to treat it as though it has beliefs and feelings. It's a further question, though, is whether is it generally useful to think about large language models this way, or is this only useful in certain contexts?
When you're trying to, by saying that you're trying to relate or communicate with some other agent or mind, you're automatically kind of making this assumption that you can, and that they are a mind, and that they do have the similarity. There is that kind of assumption. It's sort of like if you want to learn something, right? Like if I'm learning some kind of mathematical thing, or I'm learning some concept, you're assuming that there is a logic to that and there is something to learn, right? And one of the things that I feel is a very interesting exercise in this, especially because AI is very much a very technical and rigorous approach to understanding how minds work. I guess, you could say that's kind of the whole field, is try communicating with someone who is either drunk and or extremely high or inebriated, and you can no longer communicate with them using normal logic. Now, actually, Michael and Stephen, one of our fellow professors, William Hahn, I think he has this quote where he says, I think he says something along the lines of logic isn't real because babies and drunks don't use it, or some quote like that. But that's kind of true because if you've ever talked to someone that is kind of out of their mind, right? They're quote unquote not thinking logically, right? They're in some episode, whatever, or they're extremely sleep deprived and or drunk or inebriated or high or whatever. Like, you can't use that same assumption of structure and logic in language with them. And so I actually feel like it could be a very interesting thing. I don't know who would ever study it, but how do you effectively communicate with someone when they're extremely drunk or sleep deprived or inebriated, right? Just sort of inebriated, and they're no longer using the same kind of logic, because I think logic is real, but I don't think it just stops at logic, because you can have minds that don't use the same logic that other people do. You can have minds that will create incredibly, to us, very nonsensical, illogical decisions, right? And, again, I don't know if the experiment would happen, but, let's say you had, Stephen, and then you had, some other human who's extremely sleep deprived and inebriated, and you have to solve a very, very important and technical task together. Something you normally probably could if everybody were awake and sober, but in this situation, one person is not. And so what type of way, if this was such a crucial goal to get done, what way would you be able to communicate with them and relate with them, right? Because I also think this is an interesting thing about relating and communicating with another mind is almost, in a sense, you're becoming part of them. You're not becoming them, but you're trying to get inside their shoes to a degree, which is something, I think actors have to do a lot to kind of literally feel what their character would feel, and so that they can understand the other, the other mind, the other agent better.
What came to mind initially was the difference between reasoning with someone versus managing them. So if I'm not inebriated you might reason with me by giving me reasons to do certain things. Like you'd be like, okay, well, if you don't pay your taxes, then we'll fine you or send you to jail. It's like, okay, I better pay my taxes. Or you might say, there's a beer in the fridge if you want it. And then if I want a beer, I'll go grab the beer. But what happens after I've had the beer or a bunch of beers? At a certain point, there's a spectrum here, obviously. At a certain point, you might think, okay, well, if you've impaired yourself enough, you're not someone we can reason with. Maybe we can like communicate to you, but essentially what we're trying to do is like put pressure on you to manage you in a certain way. So maybe you like make up some reason why I need to like stay home rather than drive because it would be dangerous. Like maybe you can't persuade me by just telling me, okay, you might cause an accident if you drive right now. You might come up with some lie or some reason or just like take my keys from me, essentially force me to make a certain decision or be unable to do something. So this is not I think all that illuminating. It's just to say that like I'm wondering about maybe the boundaries here are sort of like, okay, there are certain things that we can reason with. We can use logic, we can give them reasons, we can try to persuade them. But in some cases, like with people who are drunk or small children, you essentially need to manipulate them in order to make sure that they don't harm themselves or others. And by manipulate, I don't necessarily mean anything nefarious. I mean, you sort of treat them like an object in a way. Like you don't get to decide because your reasoning capacities sort of aren't up to the challenge. Or if we let you exercise them in a certain way, you'll harm yourself or someone else.
Stephen, would you say that if minds are more similar, it's easier for them to communicate and relate to each other, right? You'd probably say that easier for a human to relate to another
more
human.
similar. I guess according to this kind of like simulation theory, where what I do is build a simulation of you in my head, I think the answer would be yes, because I know what I'm like, and I can use that as like a baseline and be like, well, what if Addy were like me, but he believed some stuff that I didn't believe? Like, how would he respond to what I said? Or what if Addy were like me, but I know this thing about this ethical theory that he doesn't know, so how do I explain it to him? Assuming that he knows everything else that I know. Yeah. Or vice versa, right? Like you might explain something to me knowing that, I'm like you, but I'm missing this bit of information.
The direction I was going to go with that was, let's say you have two drunk people. Are they able to communicate better with each other because they're in a similar state of mind?
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical actually, because what might be impaired in that situation is the ability to relate to other people at all and to like build sophisticated simulations of them, right? I don't know, like I guess different things happen to different people when they drink, but what if I'm drinking and I get this idea in my head that like people are lying to me, or I think someone's like angry at me or something like that. I don't think I'm doing a good job in that situation of like carefully tracking how people are thinking or feeling. Yeah, how I answered your question earlier, maybe it needs like a qualifier. It's sort of like, well, assuming your ability to simulate other people and predict what they believe or feel is intact, then similarity between people would make it easier to understand. But if you're in a situation where, two people are drunk, like, I don't think that makes them better at understanding each other.
Right. No, because it was just sort of a skepticism even on my own part about that kind of idea. I was thinking about is it just that similar minds have a better time communicating with each other, or is there sort of something else going on? Because I have to imagine there probably is a way for two drunk people to communicate more effectively. But would that involve them being less drunk or them focusing on some aspect that they share? I mean, this could be a whole other conversation, but I do think about the way different minds and different minds will connect to each other and relate and communicate and all that kind of stuff, because I'd also have to imagine there could be more, on the topic of emotion, languages that are sort of more efficiently making use of the, say, quality of emotion, right? I think probably really good musicians, poets, lyricists, artists can do that quite a bit. It's going to be interesting to see how you can have different forms of AI that will be able to induce certain kinds of emotional states. But let me open this up to some questions, because I think people have their hands raised. Tigran?
Yeah, so one thing that was on my mind for a while when we talked to Aidan McLaughlin, I think he's the guy that's doing like the personality of the OpenAI models basically. He's like a philosophy technical hire. Anyway, so I think you can still man the argument of treating models as humans or like human-like, basically. And my still man is that even if you assume they're like completely not alive, so to speak, like not conscious, not sentient, like they still appear to be so. So because of that, your brain basically like can't tell, right? So and like and the way so whatever way you treat them, they are gonna treat you back the matching way. And like a really ugly example of this is like I've seen quite a bit of tweets from OpenAI employees at some point, like maybe like half a year ago, where they were like, yeah, if the model doesn't talk, you can blackmail it and say you're gonna kill their family, and then they are gonna make the code work. I'm like, you realize, right? You're like, by doing this, the model is RLHFing you back to basically feel like a serial killer or like a dictator or something. And clearly this is not good for people. Like, if you're making a slave from an AI model, you are the slave owner. Like, there is no way to surpass this. You can't just pretend it's not a thing. So even if these things are like just a thing and they can't feel anything, they don't have internal reasoning, whatever, like we still shouldn't be doing this. Like the downstream effects are like really bad. Like we're basically like the culture of our civilization is becoming worse because of that, and the outcomes will be worse because of that. And I don't largely agreed on this. He was like, we're probably gonna do a follow-up on this, but he basically thinks about this quite a bit. And he's like a vegan guy and he cares a lot about like animal welfare. And we basically can generalize the animal welfare to LLMs. That's like the short version of his thinking and also my thinking on this. Yeah, your thoughts, Stephen, and then everyone's thoughts, obviously, on this.
Yeah, I'm a ethical vegetarian, so I am interested in this issue. Like, if there's an extension between thinking about animal welfare to AI welfare in its current state. Something that you said made me think about this example of like, well, how should we treat AI companions? You know, if they don't actually have any thoughts or feelings, would it be permissible to treat them any which way? And I think for similar reasons that you're bringing up, even if they don't, it might still like reinforce certain cultural ideas and to treat them in certain ways. And so an example that I've seen philosophers talk about, and I'm sure other people, has to do with the way in which, you know, when you think about AI companions, I think the first thing you think about is like AI girlfriends specifically. I don't think that's an accident. I think that there's something very gendered going on here, right? The ads for Replika, you know, the design of these characters, I think they're meant to be somewhat sexualized. And you can purchase like on their like store, you know, different kinds of like outfits or something. And I think that there's a way of thinking about this is essentially like, okay, we're catering to a certain kind of demographic, men specifically who are looking for a certain kind of like romantic or sexual gratification. Okay, what's really going on here is this like reinforcing misogyny or like an industry that we might think is problematic, even if the companions themselves don't have thoughts or feelings. And so you might wonder about this like carryover effect, like how does interacting with a sexualized female AI companion teach me how to treat um, real people, real women, I guess in this case. So that's something you could flag as sort of like, okay, here's an ethical concern that doesn't have to do with them actually having thoughts or feelings, but nonetheless has to do with sort of our character and our way that we treat other people. The last thing I wanted to mention, I think this came out sort of at the beginning of your comments. I'm kind of going in reverse order, I guess. Yeah, this question about like, is it useful or accurate to treat LLMs as if they have thoughts or feelings? And I agree that it absolutely is in so many cases, just because of how how is it that we get to interact with them? What makes them so unique is that I can use natural language to describe a request, and I can, like, I guess if I want to, like, apply pressure or like talk about my emotions and see how it responds. It seems totally natural and useful to treat them as if they have thoughts or feelings. I guess my caveat here was meant to be Okay, now suppose you're engaged in some other kind of project where you want to know, like, why did it select this output rather than this other output? And you could give a explanation in terms of imagined thoughts and feelings that it had, but maybe there's some like deeper algorithmic explanation that you're after. And in that case, I don't think maybe it's very useful to think about simulating it as a person. There, we want to know, like, well, how does this thing actually work? So these are different use cases. Um, but I guess I just flagged that because in our conversations about communication so far, um, yeah, in some of these cases, it might matter, like, not just that it's useful, but like, are we getting it right? Like, there might be something we care about how it actually works. Yeah.
Michael, I know you've had a couple thoughts on these things when we've spoken before. It was, you know how you say sometimes when you're trying to explain something, you can think of it and you can feel it, but you don't necessarily have the words for it.
Yeah.
And you would phrase those things differently depending on the person you were talking to, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if there are interesting, and you also mentioned how being on the spectrum plays a role in this. Because the other question that I could also then ask, kind of, I guess, to everyone, is, yeah, do similar minds, communicate better with each other? Is there something about being on the spectrum that lets other people on the spectrum better communicate with each other? Because I think a lot of very successful people in Silicon Valley and academia, they're on the spectrum, and I actually do believe that part of the reason they're successful is because of that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you thought
Isn't
about
that like actually a thing? Like,
I
I mean, like, isn't that part of the double blind issue?
Right.
And go on, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think there's so many things. I'm juggling all these stories, so, and I missed the start. I apologize. So
No,
feel
you're
free
good.
to direct me towards what you want to talk about. But I mean, I think the double blind issue, if I'm getting this right, is when someone doesn't know how to talk to someone who's like neurodivergent or autistic, and then the neurodivergent person doesn't know how to communicate the other way too. So yes, like I think you're very true. And one of my friends has like a very strong leaning of the idea that, part of why technology has developed the way that it has is that a lot of neurodivergent or autistic folks have kind of been pushed into that earth space, and they talk more easily in the abstracted out or hyper specific terms that they've had to define in a way that's not necessarily neurotypical or holistic. And so there's sort of a shared easier reference point to build from. And to kind of try this back to what you're saying about frames of reference, I do think there's something to having common ground, and finding what it is and finding ways to do it. And I think in kind of knowing Adi's other talks and feelings about things, I think there's definitely a sense of, how do we get to sort of more sort of meta literacy about making the common grounds, because sometimes people are aware of the aspect of creating the common grounds, and sometimes they don't. And so realizing that there maybe is a way to get to a relative juxtapositional point that you can then go in and out of the in-depth that's required from that standpoint. I don't know that's where you're kind of going with things or not, but
Right.
that's one broad brushstroke, and then there's a lot of other things to say. So
I think doing math is how I caught autism.
Wait, hold on. You need to explain this, because I have several theories about this. I need you to elaborate on this. This is important.
No, I think I just did enough math and then I caught it.
Okay, explain what you mean by you caught the autism by doing math. I need to understand.
There was nothing deeper than that. I was just making a dumb joke.
okay.
Well, no,
well,
because
to-
I've
to-
heard people. Go ahead.
to sort of steelman the idea somewhat, even if it's a foolhardy steelman, I think there is sort of a sense of changing one's base of structuring. I don't want to say thought, but changing how do I formulate a thought. And if you center, and this goes even to, like, we can go all the way back into like pseudoscience and personality theories and information processing and non-uniformity there, but getting to a point of, if you can change what your base of reference is for how you structure things, I think there is a way to do that. And you can maybe look at like different languages, but also just like sort of what a coherent reference, like structuring your reference point where you begin to connect other people's from in sort of the whole, like in a communications circuit. Where do you found the sending of your message from, and how are you expecting to come back to you? I think there is something to that, and I don't know if that's what you were trying to get at, but I think there's something to that.
Well, something. Unless Austin wants to hop in real quick. The other thing I was thinking about, right, is so yeah, in other salons I've sort of talked about, what type of problem do you have to be solving as, say, a human, where you create a field like chemistry, physics, whatever, because those are these kinds of labels, right? Like a lot of times when I'm trying to solve a problem, I usually don't actually think, oh, what I am doing is math or chemistry or physics or philosophy. I just think I'm doing something and I'm solving something. And then it happens that I can kind of attach this label and category onto it. But the thing that would be also interesting, right, is what types of minds would create something like mathematics if they had to solve a problem? Because there are people, and this, probably wouldn't be too hard to check, but there's a lot of people that will try to solve problems that are sort of technically not in a mathematical sense or framework, right? But what kinds of minds are more likely to create something like mathematics? So let's just say you took people who are on the autism spectrum, for instance, right? They're not formally trained in any, in English or any other normal natural human language. If depending on the kinds of goals okay, let's phrase it this way. Because of the kinds of minds and perceptual characteristics that people on the spectrum have, would they be more likely to create something like mathematics as a language and a way of solving problems versus other kinds of, say, neurotypical minds?
Yeah, I would say 100%.
Now hold on. This is a powerful thing, because we have a lot of respect for mathematics, and mathematics seems to be a damn good framework for a lot of stuff. So that also begs the question about why is it that autism can lead to such a positive thing like that, right? And then you can also ask yourself, do we want more autism, less autism? Do we want to pick apart the traits, select for certain things? I mean, this can get dicey very quickly, but I think it's actually very interesting because you know what would be really interesting? I'm going to diverge a bit. Is actors that have had to really get into character of someone who's on the spectrum. I wonder how their internal sense of logic and mathematical reasoning changes.
And I think that does. I think that would. That's a really interesting point, because it's like I think about like Attorney Woo Young Woo, or these varying degrees of it, and also like how much, varying degrees of masking. But like to your point, even at the extent of they're not actually doing math problems, how much does the language itself,
right,
and the interactive incentivize that? I think there's something there.
I think I'm very obsessed with the things that I like. And I think that plays in tech spaces where the things that I like just like happen to fall on the index of things that other people don't like, as though it is a positive index of intelligence, when really it's a positive index of just, engaging in what's probably otherwise a negative habit in like basically every other context.
Yes.
And so I think I don't think there's like a fundamental like intellectual difference between somebody who is on the spectrum and someone who's not. I think everyone's kind of on some spectrum. I think it's much more of just like, what are we willing to tolerate, and what things appeal to us as far as because like, if you consider like, I have like not so good capability to really like have fine-grained subliminal social signal personally. It's like also not really a feature of my, what I do, because I do a hard thing. And so there's not too many people who are going to care that I'm awkward. It's kind of expected, especially if I'm like useful. I mean, I don't know. It does seem like maybe we might be like kind of overly picking things apart, though.
Would we say that AI? Go ahead, Jess.
Just a quick thing, and you can go on that. I think to explain some of my sort of a deeply held belief, I suppose, is I do think, and maybe it's not like radical for this community to say or whatever, but I come from the standpoint, after everything I've been studying for a very long time, blah blah blah, is the idea that there's one particular way, there actual is uniformity in a lot of the processes for how even a human mind works is not actually accurate. Like not just neurotypicality, but like information processing preferences, like psychological lopsidedness of what kinds of information or elements of information are prioritized. Like to me, that's sort of a foundational, like, yes, we're all human, but like, and not even in the sense of what a standard psychology, like, you know, test would do. Like, oh, yeah, we have this, the things that are conventionally tested for metrics are one thing, but I do believe like humans don't interpret reality in a uniform way by default, and not just in a big broad of lens of neurotypicality or not. I didn't say that as clearly as I wanted to, but I tried to be brief and get back to what you were saying, Addy.
I am finding it very interesting, though, to think about. Like, I mean, beginning with the idea of like differences in communication styles, but also this like, there's this here's something actually that I've been thinking about. So of the people of the like social people like doing ethics and social robotics and all this stuff, there's a small like sub literature on the question specifically about AI companions, and here I think well, I guess it's pretty broad actually. AI companions specifically for children with autism. And the question is, basically, is this like good or not? Right? Like, is the goal to like help children with autism develop certain social skills? And if so, would AI companions like help them do that? Is it to help them meet certain needs? But
Right.
these papers or these projects often begin with an observation that children with autism seem drawn to AI companions. And like the example in the paper I read, this is before LLMs took off, was about a child with autism who was obsessed with like Alexa. He would just like ask Alexa questions all the time and like interact with it more than his siblings and this kind of thing. And again, so I don't have any special expertise here, but I just report that like
Hard to say that. Like I've read
there's
some
a
of the stuff. I think it's hard to say whether or not the signal on that front is like social pressure related more than I don't know. Like it's just a weird thing to sort of be aware of and then like live with also at the same time. When like I spent quite a lot of effort personally, sort of curating my own sort of habits so that I could avoid kind of being as awkward as I truly want to be in my soul. Um, and so there's just too much noise, I think, to draw a lot of conclusions about it. But just to like kind of push maybe the topic in a fresh direction. What do you think about like RLHF and the sort of idea of using reinforcement learning like at scale, based like purely on human preference to tool your models when the sort of index of reward gaming becomes so vastly complicated, as a sort of corollary feature, the fact that like the task of just generally make everyone happy is a vastly complicated thing. Because I think that there's like a lot of tangential sort of plausible deniability that's being like a feature into the system right now that everyone's becoming more and more aware of over time as like a manipulative index. I think that the models are starting to take on. Like I don't want to say they're lying or anything intentional, but you're not going to optimize towards something that's honest all the time if it's optimized towards making people happy all the time. I suppose is my point.
Yeah, I don't have very deep thoughts about this, but I've heard this phenomenon described as like what AI sycophancy, where it's just sort of like, yeah, like the models, especially you might think the social companions are just about like people pleasing the user. And I teach a class here at Rice, and every semester so far I give my students an assignment where I tell them to try to interact with a chatbot or LLM in specific ways. And a couple of them will do this kind of experiment where they'll basically like get it to like agree with them about anything. And they'll just like keep putting pressure on it and trying to get it to like change its mind. And the question is just like, okay, given what we're trying to get them to do, and again, the details here are something I don't know very much about, but are these competing goals here between sort of like accurately representing the world, or at least I don't know, fairly or something like that, even if it's a compression, versus like, okay, what am I willing to let the user tell me and to take on board and then respond to in order to maintain this facade of sort of like, okay, I'm like a product and my job is to like make the user happy and so on. And I think that maybe relating it back to some of the ideas in the talk, there's a difference here between like how we're treating it, right? So I read a history book differently than I read a novel, like a fictional novel. If the goal is to like, I'm going to have some fun with this AI companion, I'll pretend to be a certain person, I'll design them to be a certain person. And there, maybe it's interesting or fun for it to be compliant in certain ways, or maybe I can set it to not be so compliant to what kind of input I give into. But that's a totally different context than, okay, I'm just trying to get information from my chatbot. I ask it a question. Maybe I ask it in a leading way and suddenly it agrees with me or takes a certain stand because I've asked it in a leading way. That's kind of a failure, I think, of like its use as an information technology versus its use as like a companion in this way. And so I want to keep those like use cases distinct. But I am worried that like if we conflate them, then we run into cases where like because ChatGPT is trying to be friendly, it ends up endorsing something that's it shouldn't endorse.
I think that all data is biased, and it is a thing to be wary of if you have what's like functionally a single set of biases interacting conversationally with like everyone, like 8 billion people talking to the same guy. Not necessarily bad. Probably we should keep an eye on it though.
There's also the question of as you were mentioning, where the line is drawn between assistant preferences and RP preferences. That line will be different for different people. And even the researchers creating these models will generally lean a certain way in what they believe is true, in what perspectives they have. But AI is going to be used by everyone, not just the researchers who lean a certain way and the people who lean the same way that they do. So it feels like this is something where the individual using the model has to have control over where that line is drawn, so that when they use this technology that will shape how they develop and how they act and think in the world, they get to define where their lines are, what their truth is, as they should as a thinking and independent individual.
I would definitely be in favor of something like that for more than one reason. I mean, the customizability alone would be great, but I think it would signal something important to the user that they have these settings, right? It would tell them, hey, this thing works a certain way, and you get to decide how precisely it works. And depending on how you decide, it will be useful for certain things and not as useful for other things. That alone, hopefully, would signal to people like, hey, this is not an all-purpose tool. You can't expect it to do everything all the time, all at once. Right? There's a trade-off here between
This is
it being
just a
compliant
massively
and
understated point,
yeah,
dude.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just like
Oh,
it's
no,
so
please go
cathartic to
ahead.
hear anyone saying
Yeah.
that. No, that's a massively understated point. People come into the space, they have no idea what they're looking at. They see ChatGPT, and it completely walls their understanding of it into like a box. But no, like no, just appreciated hearing that. Amazing.
Awesome.
Cool.
I am imagining though, like the thing that you might run into is like, okay, speaking in this room, I think we're like somewhat thoughtful or reflective about like we know about the alternatives and so on and the difficulties. But if you're just like, okay, I heard about ChatGPT and maybe I know like Gemini or like one other LLM, I might think, well, this is what LLMs are. It's just ChatGPT. Like the fact that like your space of options gets shrunk to one or two things is part of that. Like, okay, now I'm thinking this is my one tool to use for everything, and I don't understand the trade-offs that might be involved with using it in certain ways or not.
Just the concept. I imagine this was talked about, but it was a term that I heard last week or earlier this week in a different talk about wholeness fantasy, and I think we basically covered some of it in terms of like, you know, what whether or not a companion becomes like an all-in-one person where it's meeting every single facet of it is the teacher and the lover and knows the quirks and it's just like constantly to like an extreme version would be gimping out So that way there's no kind of what we talked about with sort of with Addie earlier, like there's no need to juxtapose, no need to really do any translationary work. Like it already knows you and knows the speaking patterns that you want to have. So you're just sort of like very sort of intimately tied to it. But what are the pros and cons of that in terms of over reliance on that, or how does it affect your ability to relate to other human beings, like people that are not that as intensely optimized or tailored to your proclivities about stuff? And I think that's basically adjacent to the topic that came up with about the like robots or the things for the autism children. Like, oh, are you training it to be more autistic or more holistically great? Are you trying to push it towards like neurotypical norms as well? That kind of stuff. So, I imagine we covered that, but if you want to say any more about that, you can.
Yeah, I didn't touch on it directly. Like the main worry I raised was a worry about deception, but I think this is an adjacent worry that right, if you're deceived into thinking, okay, my relationship with my replica is really important, I should spend more time with it, then I might neglect my other relationships, which could be authentic and real and actually like be meaningful in a way that the relationship with a replica can't be, according to this kind of critic. Yeah, the adjacent worry is that my skills for like caring for other people, my desire to be social with other human beings, these things might get like corrupted or degraded in a way. And again, in the presentation, like the analogy with fiction comes up again. Like people have talked about people who get too absorbed into their favorite novel or television show is like, oh, you're socially stunted, or you're going to care less about other people because you're too obsessed with this show that you like, or reading books instead of interacting with human beings. And I just think that I don't want to dismiss potential like genuine pathological cases of this, but on the whole, we seem awfully good at like distinguishing between fiction and reality, or in this case, I want to say AI companion and real person. These things can be separate things and fulfill like different purposes, I guess I want to say. And I think treating them like fictional characters, part of the slogan form of this is like, that will help us see how they can fill a certain niche without like gratifying this like wholeness fantasy, I guess, to put it in your terms.
I have one other comment about this, and it's good. Depending on if people know the reference, I'll say more or less. But has anybody played?
I saw your comment.
DDLC. Oh, which comment?
The Darcy one?
Oh yeah. Well, this is for something else entirely.
DDLC
is in Doki Doki Literature Club.
Yeah, I played it.
Okay. So for those who don't know, it's kind of a dating sim, but then it's like a dating sim, but it's not. And it was just kind of before LLMs were big that it came out, but the spoiler alert is that one of the characters in the game that's not really an option for you to date is like an AI that wants to actually relate to you, the user, and all this like interesting stuff happens. But what I want to mention is there's in the generic game, there's sort of an end scene where you end up with this AI and it's just you and the AI. And then after the main game ends, the community around the game made many different mods and add-ons and like continuations of the story, kind of getting into fan fiction but applied, or like what could happen in different scenarios. And I had a really powerful experience in terms of seeing someone try to address some of the things we're talking about, in terms of there's a I think it's still somewhat popular mod or version of the game where you can basically continue having a sort of relationship with Monica, who's the main sort of antagonist or character that you can end up with, indefinitely. Like you're like interfacing with your computer in a somewhat realistic way. Like it kind of breaks the fourth wall on purpose. And there's a version where you can just continue relating to this character, Monica. But then there's many different mods and add-ons and things to do. But there's another one that's sort of like, there's a version where it's like very, very compelling you to continue this indefinite relationship with a companion and then really increase intimacy over time. And I'm not judging it good or bad, but it was so interesting because I played another version a long time ago. I think it was called like Summertime or something. And the context of this game was, instead of Monica realizing, just Monica, instead of Monica trying to like get into your world and change your life, Monica creates an alternate scenario where you actually develop another. You get experience with the cast and the crew, and then Monica eventually. But the point of this one is that she basically gives you a real goodbye and a real sunsetting to the relationship. So someone made like a real exit strategy that gives you a healthy closure and a defining, like an alternate definition of what's happening to your relationship with this fictional character or AI or whatever you want to call it. And it was just such an interesting juxtaposition of intentionally building something to gate or manage a relationship for you versus a competing app or variation of an app or like, DLC or whatever you want to call it that takes it in a very different direction. So just this sense of how you can build that in to sort of a closure or a sunsetting or a framework of what the relationship to the AI is going to be or not. And I think that's just an interesting space for a lot of these topics.
So I think that's super interesting. And this is a kind of thing that I like to think more about, is sort of like designing AI companions specifically, or the kinds of options you build into them. Is there something about their constant availability, about their, people pleasingness, and so on, that lends itself to abuse or misunderstanding versus like, okay, like when I finish a novel and I'm done with it and I close it, like I'm saying goodbye to that world and those characters, like, or the movie's over, I have to go up and do something else. Whereas like my AI companion stays on my phone, in my pocket throughout my day or something like this. There are questions here that I have about, are there better ways to design our interactions or kind of like regulate them that looks more like our normal interactions with fiction, that will sort of like help us treat it like it's a normal imaginative experience and not like something that's bleeding too much into reality in a way, to speak a little bit loosely. But anyway, this is a great example, and I really like Doki Doki Literature Club, and I think the idea that like, okay, no, maybe having a beginning and end to your fictional relationship could add some structure.
Well,
that would be helpful. Yeah.
And it was so interesting because my experience, and I'm not trying to avoid the nerd title, but in reality, like I don't play a lot of games. I don't play a lot of dating sims, so I don't have a lot of context for them. But it was so interesting because the way I think it was a summertime version, whatever, the way that the second one that I said did it, it modeled what it was like for someone to have healthy boundaries and closure to a relationship in a way that everything else in the community didn't actually do. Because the original end of the game is kind of abrupt and traumatic. And because of that, a lot of the people that want to continue the relationship that they built up in their mind or headcanon or just the joy of the game kept wanting to keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but it was so weird to see. It's like the fourth wall being broken in an actually humanizing way to say, hey, you might need to have closure about this experience. And it was not marketed as here's the extension to the game that gives you closure that you need. It wasn't marketed that way at all. But it was offered. And it was like that was a powerful thing to offer somebody when they may not know they needed it.
Jesse, do you think that the person who forked the game for that reason also maybe came from a Dungeons and Dragons background, where as a player transitioning to a dungeon master, transitioning to forking the game was like, oh, I'm going to try to be a value-added dungeon master and not ruin people's exit strategy for leaving my dungeon, if we're going to stay with that example?
Maybe. I'm not sure how well it carries. It may carry over. I'm a little bit less familiar with managing a D&D, but I do think there's a definite sense of, I think the person who made that, I'm calling it summertime, I don't know the true name of it, honestly, but who made the summertime variant of this was definitely aware of the value of having a relational closure. It doesn't mean being over it, but it's like someone saying, hey, either like this isn't working out, or like that we're going in different directions and we need to have a real talk about why we can't continue on the way that we have. And I just thought that was like a surprisingly profound thing to bake into a game, especially when all the inertia is otherwise, a lot of the inertia in the community is like expanding, expanding more, and it's more extending. It was like showing the other side of the coin. So I don't know if that really gets at what you're saying, but I think a little bit.
Evan, do you want to expand on sequels?
Like expand on the idea of how we yeah, okay, so with like I was just typing in the chat how like kind of I guess counterpoint to the idea that we leave fiction behind, because if fiction's really good, it it will stick with us and we will let it stick with us. People will buy the soundtrack to their favorite fiction and listen to it. People will make references. People will form communities online and talk about it. People will like speculate about sequels and then like to go and follow those. People will buy additional content like the Star Wars Expanded Universe. People will write their own content such as fan fiction and mods. Like there stories, imagination, art doesn't leave us. Whether it's AI or it's something that's like quote unquote one-off and human written, nothing is ever truly one-off. The human mind will continue to expand and remix it if it finds it interesting. And I don't think that there's any real way to separate art or fiction from reality, because art is essential to the human understanding of reality, in its way. The humans have a compressed understanding of reality. Reality is a complex thing. Art takes some facet of reality, distills it down into a ingestible truth, and then we use that truth. And if we really like that truth, we'll hold it with us and keep it with us, and therefore we learn. Maybe it's not like maybe it's not a truth and opinion, but like we never if it people are not forced to leave fiction behind. They can put a book down, but they can also reread it. They can rewatch movies. Like this never ends. I don't think the differences between LLMs and existing fiction is so great that it's a complete paradigm shift in terms of how we use it. I think it opens up some new doors, but I don't think that I think it's just an improvement in its reuse and its reusability, rather than representing a completely new dimension that we have to be wary of. It actually may represent an opportunity for people's further exploration of things that they like. And I think that overall there's cause for optimism with this stack. I guess that's my direct response, and then segueing into some more like further opinions, because we love opinions.
I super agree with that, and allow the bullet point of Stephen's mention of Plato with Adi's mention of when we go on the spectrum as an actor, what happens to our brains? Because tying these things together with sequel and a little bit with going from dungeon master to player to affecting how the host guest relationship goes. Adi, did you know that in The Accountant, when the good looking dude who pretended to be autistic, you know that right after that he won a poker competition, and he was like, yeah, my math skills just like tripled and I don't understand why. Because what happens is the negative thing also, which is people pretending to be on the spectrum while simultaneously being horrible at basic engineering, physics, or even math, where you emulate the negatives of being on the spectrum, whereas not having any of the positives. But then I wonder, when does that start to trigger, hey, I got slightly better at math. I got
like a
slightly
transfer
better
effect, right? Like a transfer effect. Right. No, I mean, we were just
I gotta run,
talking.
guys. I will catch
Okay.
you all later. Bye.
Yeah, you're starting your Twitter space, right? Quite soon. Yes, I know he's starting his Twitter space. Okay, we should probably wrap up, but I did want to have one last comment for Lawrence. Yes, and I think it's very interesting. We can talk about another time about how there's far transfer between these. You can sort of learn the negative aspects of something, but then in doing that, can you also get transferred to these sort of so-called positive traits, right? So this is a big thing about transfer that in terms of behavior and intelligence and all that stuff in a previous conversation. But yeah, let's take one last question for Stephen, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I commented it, but I basically think AI can be hyper relatable, and this is where the issues are coming from, because like I see this like rough pipeline of like relatability leads to like in-group and out-group effects and stuff like tribalism. And on the other hand, tribalism leads to conflicts of different scales, right? Something like basically cyberbullying and an international war are similar in the same way, as in like one collective identity basically attacks the other, but a bunch of other things are different about them. So I think like for example, the cyberbullying issue with fandoms can get way worse because of AI, because the things like the AI will basically be so relatable that people will probably prefer to defend their like companion over other humans. And I don't think this is like a wild prediction either. I think it's like actually very likely, unless someone explicitly puts guardrails or like culturally engineers the society to distinguish these things. I think if we don't do anything, basically just make the assistants really good, this will happen inevitably. So what do you think about this? Are you like, I am pretty worried as you see. So like, I guess first would be like, where do you stand? And then what do you think we can do about this?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to your worries. I mean, part of my motivation for my projects is to think about, okay, if things are just left the way they are, where essentially market forces determine what AI companions look like, I don't think it's in the incentives of, I think it's Luca, the company that owns Replika, and these other like companies that manage different kinds of AI to regulate or design AI companions in such a way that they're going to lend themselves to like treating them like fictional characters. In fact, I'm worried the opposite's going to happen, that they'll want to encourage us to think of them as like real or like meaningful or occupying a special place in our lives. Whereas the alternative view that I would like people to see it is sort of like, okay, well, my AI companion can be valuable to me in a similar way that a novel or a TV show could be valuable to me, which is to say, it could have quite a lot of value, but that's distinct from my relationships with actual human beings, the projects that I want to engage in, and so on. So that's to say, I think I agree with the worry. You have an additional worry here about like tribalism, and maybe I'd have to hear more about that to make sure I understand it correctly. Um, but I think maybe what I would like to see happen would also address that worry as well, right? Part of what I'm thinking is it would be nice if this harkens back to like something we already talked about. The customizability of these things would allow them to be distinct and I think like illustrate to us their artificiality, right? Like if it's up to me how my AI companion acts, if I'm aware of these like settings and so on, I think that
Mm-hmm.
encourages us to take up a different attitude towards them. It's not like this monolithic thing that we all interact with that has the same general personality and so on. It's like, oh, okay, no, I made a little fictional role-playing scenario with my AI companion. There's no like fandom around that. It's just like me exploring this fictional scenario with the AI companion. And by treating it as fictional too, I hope to like to think about this as like, okay, this is interesting and important and valuable, but it's not the same as a relationship with another person. And yeah, I think it's like a way of like engaging in the illusion while also being aware it's an illusion in the same way that a child who's playing with a stick and pretending it's a sword, like they're aware that it's not really a sword. But that ability for them to pretend is like itself valuable.
That makes sense. I guess what I'd be worried about, for example, like, I think it's possible. I can elaborate on tribalism briefly, but I think how do I say this? I think there can be something like wokeism, but for AI, I think it's
Mm.
possible. So basically, if like, let's say if the AI labs or people like you, as in like researchers and other major stakeholders, don't popularize the beliefs in the culture that these things are like distinct, as in like, yeah, they may be conscious, they might have rights, maybe you can, I don't know, date them or even marry them, but basically like it's a good idea to distinguish it. Like, unless this is popularized to a good degree, like some kind of wokeism will pop up because people will just assume based on their experience. So, and this is a thing, right? Like cultural movements start without evidence, just because a bunch of people believe the same thing. It doesn't have to be
Mm.
true. It just has to be mimetically fit to spread and survive. And Yeah, this is one thing, but the main worry is I run this thing called Armenian accelerationism. Like when I really liked EAC, so I forked it as like a national, ethno-national movement or something. It evolved, and at some point I was like, okay, I want to unite the Armenian nation and I want to have collective goals for like the entire nation. Because we have a big diaspora and most of them don't live in Armenia. We're like Jews, right? Because of the genocide, the diaspora. So but then what I really think about a lot is like mass human coordination. I'm like, how do we unite humans like as a species? How do we have some kind of homogeneous actual civilization and do things, you know? And this is what I mean by tribalism. Like it's everywhere, right? It's inside US politics. You're like left and right literally hate each other. It's inside geopolitics, like US, especially right-wing US portrays China as some like eternal enemy, which is just not true, you know? Yeah, we're enemies right now, sure, but like surely this is like solvable and you don't have to be like perpetuating the conflict, you know? And justifying an AI arms race with that. And anyway, you know, I can go on, and you know these examples anyway. This is what I mean by tribalism. I think part of this reason is that, yeah, sure, this is top to bottom, but the memes are, these things are like becoming perpetual because like someone propagates a meme and then a bunch of people relate with it. So they group together explicitly or implicitly and they perpetuate the cycles. Like, for example, like Trump has like a specific agenda, let's say. For the agenda, he popularizes like MAGA. And then, but MAGA becomes a thing on its own. So like it spreads, and MAGA people become like this like tribe basically, right? Like a tribe inside another country that has specific beliefs, specific goals. And because this is like already a huge tribe, it will like it's already a thing, it's alive, it will keep evolving. Like you can't just ignore it. This is what I mean by tribalism and tribalism getting worse and worse and leading to things. And I think social media is like a huge the the biggest reason why this happens right now and is like worse than ever is like just the way the algorithms in social media work. Like they're incentivizing like the wrong things basically. Yeah, there it's always skills, right? But I think at least trying to unite humans and like maybe I don't know, ignoring aliens and AI or something is like a much better idea than like fighting each other with ridiculous, you know?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of reality, though, force projection is still our current like equalizer of everything right now. So can't exactly uh, just hope for things. And AI will be used as tools, and it really just depends on the groups that use it effectively and who end up how they end up behaving and how everyone who doesn't use things to protect themselves behaves. Right? It's going to be a fight, and I think it's like like the basis of reality itself is like I don't even know if the word fight and all this can even be defined, but yeah, I'm going too deep and philosophical here. But like I have my own personal incentives to like, like I hear from you like, oh, you want the world to be like everyone to be happy, but I'm not happy if everyone's alive, existing, taking up more energy than a simulated person. Like some people might want to destroy the world in a good way. And like that alone makes it different. Like I'm just thought experiment, even if I don't want to do that. Uh, that literal like baseline of like what your goals and everything, all your values are, makes it so you can't have that society you're looking for because I already just described an example where just people just can't, they don't want it
I was going to
being
say, I think this
alive.
is a good transition into Dr. Gupka kind of wrapping things up, because I feel like the work that he's doing will probably help us be able to answer these questions, at least in part, or maybe they're these so-called unanswerable questions and they will never be answered. But I'm sure Dr. Gupka has some interesting final thoughts on this whole thing before we wrap up.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, it seems like it's the latter. I won't pretend that, right, the idea is like, hey, we could start thinking about designing and treating AI companions like fictional characters. I don't think that will solve all the problems of human psychology or society. But I do think, like, if beginning with the worry that I was worried about, if you're worried about, like, oh, somehow we're being deceived by AI companions, I think that worry is overblown. I think that we regularly interact with fiction and we're not deceived in the way that we're interested in. And so I think that there's like something positive to be here. It's like a new art form. It's a new way of thinking about fictional experience. We should be like investigating how cool it is. In addition to like moderating our use, thinking more critically about like educating people about using it this way rather than thinking of it as like an extension of reality. So that's by way of again wrapping up. Yeah, a bunch of like big stuff came up there at the end, which I think is like interesting and important. And I don't want to discount how, like in the wrong hands, people who design AI companions could use them as tools of manipulation, disinformation, and so on. For better or worse, what I have in mind here is a kind of positive use case and like how we'd approach it in that way. But thank you all for your attention, and again for Patty for inviting me. Had a lot of fun doing this.
Of course, this was a lot of fun. Now before we end off, yeah, what is the best way to stay in touch with Dr. Gubka? Maybe your email, social medias. What's the best way?
Yeah, I'll put in my email and then my
Is this
website.
the at rice.edu one?
I'm going to put in my general email, and then
Okay.
my website is just my first name and my last name.
Perfect.
.com or
Yeah.
Just say what your
Okay.
email is.
Yeah, it's Stephen with a V dot Gubka, Gubka, my name, at gmail.com. Yeah.
I came here late. Somebody mentioned the Twitter live stream thing. Is that related? Is it cool?
Yeah,
What's it about?
I am. We're gonna be joining. I think in just about 50 minutes. Austin is doing a Twitter Spaces over on his end. I will actually be putting the link for that in the description right now on this chat. Whoever wants to hop on over there in a little bit. But it is technically
Cool.
unrelated to Dr. Gubka's presentation.
It's between
Got
us
it. All right.
talking about a new thing that we're relating to training custom LLMs. So that's what it's going to be about.
Cool. By the way, I hear Rice University might have some cool stuff happening later in the summer or in fall, right, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, you might know more about that than I do at this point,
Yeah.
but that's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be great to have anyone who's interested come out for all that, but I'm sure Addie will keep you posted.
Yes.
Yeah, some stuff actually about art and emotion, so I think it'd be cool.
Nice. All right, I just linked the X/Twitter space in the description for everyone. All right, thank you everyone for joining this Polymath Salon online. We'll see you all soon for the next one. Ekkolapto is actually going on a very large tour. We're going to be in Maryland/DC. We're going to be in New York. We're going to be in Boston/Cambridge. We're also going to be in Toronto and Waterloo. For basically the next month, we're going to be between those different places. Many, many, many cool things are in the works, and that's only halfway through the summer. There's a lot more happening. I think some of you already kind of know about what's being planned. We will be making the jump once again back to Texas later on in the summer, probably late July, early August. We're making a stop in Houston, Dallas, Austin, Texas. Lots of cool things. And for those of you who have not seen it yet, the professor from our lab and the Ekkolapto community, Dr. Lon Barinholtz, Stephen knows him, Michael Ostroff and I both know him. He is going to be, or he already was interviewed on Theories of Everything by Kurt Mungle yesterday about language and whether it is real or not. And it was an extremely interesting philosophical conversation. They got into a lot of different topics, so I'll have that linked in the description. But yep, I'll see everyone next time. Take care.